So we'll be studying today about the evolutionary explanation of behavior for IB psychology students. We'll be understanding the concept first and then followed by the supporting studies. So we all know that what is evolutionary explanation. Evolutionary explanation is about Darwin's theory, about the survival of the fittest, about the natural selection. We all have studied, grade 11 students here in psychology must have studied all this in their science in their grade 9th or 10th maybe. So today we are going to study about the modern explanation of the evolutionary theory. So this is a modern explanation. This is the old explanation of evolutionary theory along with the genetics that we have recently studied. So the combination of both the things, the combination of Darwin's theory and the genetics together makes the modern theory of evolutionary explanation of behavior. Very first point here to remember is that all biological organisms, be it the humans, the animals, all the biological organisms have a basic instinct to survive and reproduce. So it is the survival. So they adapt themselves, they change themselves, whatever difference, whatever evolution is happening, whatever development of the organism is happening, it is because adapted by the animals only to survive. So their main purpose, their main instinct is to survive and to reproduce as well. There are 4 postulates of Darwin's theory, out of which the third one is the differential fitness. So what exactly is differential fitness? It means that an organism change their traits in order to adapt to the given environment. So whatever is their environment, to survive in that environment and hence to reproduce, they change their traits. So let me give you some examples here. For example, snowshoe hares. In the summer, snowshoe hares are brown, but they grow white coats in the winter to camouflage in the snow. So since you are clear with the differential fitness, the next point is survival of the fittest. I am sure grade 11 students here, the IB psychology students must have learned the same in their junior classes, but just for a quick recap. So what is survival of the fittest? All the organisms with the changing environment, they need to change their traits in order to adapt themselves to the environment. So the organisms who are able to adapt themselves according to the environment, they are able to survive further. And the ones who are not able to change along with the time, with the time they're not able to change, they're not able to change their traits, they are not able to survive anymore. So another last point in here in the introduction is natural selection. So all those organisms who are able to adapt themselves, their genes are passed on to their offsprings. And the organisms that are not able to adapt themselves, those genes, particularly genes, get weaker, they are not passed on to the offspring, and those genes completely get vanished from them. So this is called as natural selection, where gradually as those organisms are less adapted, do not pass on their genes, those genes dissipate from the population gene pool. More adapted organisms produce more offspring, so their genes in the gene pool get stronger. This is called as natural selection. So there are many examples for that, like if you can see this, in the corner of the eye, this particular organ which was used to wipe off the cornea of our eye was no longer used in human beings, and gradually it shrinked down to this much. So there are many examples of such things, but we'll not be going deeper into it because we have much more to cover this chapter today. Modern research has shown that in terms of their DNA, humans are 99.5% similar to each other. As a species, we share 98% of genes with chimpanzees, 90% with cats, 69% with rats, and 60% with chickens and fruit flies. This hints at the possibility of using animals to get an insight into human behavior and links to the principles of a biological approach to behavior. So what is evolutionary psychology that we are going to study? Evolutionary psychology means that the genes mutate, and whichever genes are the advantageous ones for our survival, they are passed further due to the process of natural selection. And it is important to note that natural selection do not select a certain behavior that this is the best behavior and this has to be passed on through the genes. No, it is not the behavior that is a natural selection. It is the genes particularly that is chosen by the process of natural selection. Those particularly genes further show a certain kind of behavior. So behavior is not passed on further, it is the gene that is passed on further. That particular gene is responsible for a certain kind of behavior. So the gist of this whole evolutionary psychology is that behaviors could be inherited and are genetic as well. So the first is random genetic mutations give some individuals a better chance to survive and pass on their genes. For example, the first giraffe born with a long neck was initially a freak of nature. But then that giraffe survived and reproduced, and long necks have been passed down for generation upon generation. Now short-necked giraffes are the freaks of nature. Evolution itself is guided by the survival of the fittest, which doesn't always favor the strongest and the fastest so much as those best suited to the current environment. So it is not that any organism that is the strongest or the fastest is definitely going to survive. There could be some animals who are not the strongest, who are not the fastest, are able to survive. It depends that how they have changed their genes over a period of time, how their genes have mutated, or how best they have adapted themselves to the environment. So on the basis of this, their presence or their extinction depends. Then, however, the key element of evolution is not survival but reproduction. So essentially, any mutation or behavior that results in survival and reproduction, which then lets more copies of the genes be passed on, may eventually result in the evolution of the species. So it is not about survival, it is about the reproduction. Survival is only when I am present, I am not getting extinct. So this is only the survival of me. But reproduction is when my offsprings are coming. So it is only the passing on the genes, and only the genes that are the stronger, able to adapt themselves to the given environment or the time, they are able to pass on to the offsprings. So it is basically not the survival but the reproduction that matters according to evolutionary psychology. Then we have the main evolutionary process is natural selection, which refers to how organisms better adapted to the environment are likelier to survive and reproduce. It's important to note that this doesn't happen on the species level or even the organism level. It happens on a genetic level. For example, a gene may make someone more altruistic, which in turn allows fellow members of the species to survive and reproduce. Is more likely to be naturally selected than a gene for self-preservation. So it is not an organism who has been naturally selected or is, we can say it's the survival of the fittest. So it is not an organism. It is not the whole species that we say is, survival of the fittest. It is the best species. It is the best, organism. It is all not on that big level. It is on the very, very tiniest, very, very small level. It is the gene. So the gene out of the whole pool is selected that this gene is good. For example, like just now I told you, if the gene is of altruistic gene, if it is showing that you help other people, so if that kind of gene is being activated in us, that is a strong gene, because when we help people, we are basically trying to help them to survive, and hence they will be reproducing rather than being selfish. So this altruistic gene is a good gene, which definitely is the strongest, is adaptive to the environment, and is likely to pass on into the offsprings. Then evolution isn't really about survival and adaptation so much as it's about reproduction. In the simplest terms, random genetic mutations cause animals to behave in different ways. And some of those behaviors resulted in a mutated gene being passed on to the next generation. So evolutionary psychology tells us that there are these certain behaviors which have been helpful in the survival of human species, because these are the behaviors that have been helpful and is across the universe, irrespective of the culture, the gender, the race, or whatsoever. For example, looking at a rotten egg, we all feel disgusted. Or if there is a fungus, a bacteria on something, be it a Chinese or an American, Indian, or Afghanistani, or European, or anybody at all, everybody is likely to feel disgusted at the look of the bacteria, fungus, rotten egg, and so on. Or at the same time, smile is one of the gesture that is there, that is across there worldwide. And other things like getting attracted to people who have bodily features that are more inclined towards childbearing, so we get attracted to those kind of certain features, so that for the offspring thing. So these are the certain things that are not just restricted to one kind of race or culture, it is across the world. That means these certain behaviors have been passed on from generation to generation over the years. That clearly shows that this is the result why these certain behaviors have been responsible for the survival of the human being species. So evolution and emotion, evolutionary psychology covers a lot of territory. It's been used to explain altruism, perception of race, conflict, emotion, memory, language, friendship, attraction, cognitive biases, personality, name it. And evolutionary psychology has probably studied it. Now here we focus on emotion. So we'll be talking about the the basic emotions that are worldwide across the race and culture. It has been identified by evolutionary psychologists. So what are these and how emotions are innate? So Paul Ekman began investigating the universality of emotion and its possible evolutionary origin in 1950s, and he's probably the world's leading researcher on emotional expression. In the early 1970s, Ekman went to New Guinea to study the four cultural group, who were a pre-literate Neolithic culture who had not yet been exposed to emotional expressions in modern culture through mass media or whatever. Throughout history, they have been isolated in the highlands of remote New Guinea. After telling participants a story and then asking them to select from a set of 3 faces the emotion most appropriate to the story, Ekman found that 4 identified the emotions in pretty much the same way as all the other cultural groups he had studied all over the world. So this ultimately suggested that the association between facial muscular patterns and discrete emotions is universal. In theory, that happens because of evolution. Through his research on emotional expression in people all over the world, Ekman has identified 6 primary emotions: fear, disgust, surprise, anger, happiness, and sadness. Ekman believes that since emotions are expressed facially in the same way across every culture, this is evidence that emotions are innate. Evolutionary psychologists argue that responses such as fear or disgust are adaptive. As our genes mutate, those that are advantageous for survival are passed down through a process of natural selection. Fear or disgust then make an organism more likely to survive and then reproduce. While evolutionary psychologists are a long way from being able to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between genes and evolutionary behaviors, the research has applications in almost every aspect of human life. Arguably, evolutionary psychology can even explain why people laugh. So these facial expressions, these emotions that we show, this is not just the emotions and some cognitive processes. These have been passed on from generation to generation only from the process of natural selection, because these emotions have helped us in our survival and hence further in reproducing. So for example, we'll be talking about fear and disgust now. So let's do one supporting study. Before we study a supporting study, let's understand the connection between evolution and emotion. It is very difficult to connect these two things, evolution and emotion. Let's take one of the emotions such as disgust. So what is the connection between evolution and disgust? For example, you have a bread lying on the platform of your kitchen and it has got fungus on it. Now the look of it and the smell of it gives you the emotion of disgust. So you feel disgusted when you look at the bread. Now this disgust emotion is coming, it is giving a signal to your body, to your brain, that you should stay away from this. Do not touch it, do not eat it for sure, because if you're going to eat it, it is going to make you sick. So you will fall ill if you eat it. So we don't want to get sick, ill, and finally maybe die or something like that. So in order to get any kind of food poisoning, to get any kind of major illness, and to protect ourselves, this emotion disgust is very, very important for our survival. And the moment we see anything that is rotten, that is, it has some maybe worms on it or things like that, so all of a sudden, just at the look of it, we come up with an emotion of disgust. So it might be difficult to find a connection between evolution and emotions like sadness or happiness. With disgust, the connection is a whole lot clearer. If people wrinkle up their faces at the sight of pustulent wounds or rotting food, then they have a better chance of avoiding deadly illness or food poisoning. Therefore, disgust may have evolved to protect people from poisoning themselves or eating harmful substances. This section focuses on two studies providing evolutionary explanation for disgust. Daniel Fessler investigated disgust response in pregnant women and found disgust responses were strongest in the first trimester, when the fetus was most vulnerable to infection. Now, this is just so interesting to study, that the women in their first trimester, that is the first 3 months of their pregnancy, they have a very strong sense of disgust. So the moment they smell anything that is not good, they, feel like they have this nausea and feel like vomiting, and they just stay away from that food. Now, why this emotion, or why this feeling of disgust is so strong in the first trimester, first 3 months of a pregnant woman? Because the fetus inside the woman's body is very, very fragile, and it is extremely fragile that it can, even with the slightest of the some slightest of the bacteria or anything like that, something can happen. So the body just needs to protect that small fetus. So the body needs to protect that small fetus, and in order to protect that, the feeling of disgust really highs or gets intense in pregnant women in their first trimester. So how the human being has adapted themselves in order to survive and to keep their offspring also protected. Next is, similarly, Val Curtis studied disgust emotions to a variety of images and found that disgust may have evolved as protection against disease. Either way, disgust appears to have at least some evolutionary origin. So disgust and protection from disease. The thing about disgust is that so many stimuli trigger it, and nobody really knows why. Until recently, there weren't any theories offering a coherent explanation of why so many different stimuli could all provoke the same emotional response of disgust. Presumably, it's at least partly due to evolution. So let's do a study here by Curtis et al. And see that how evolution and disgust are actually connected to each other. Curtis et al. Decided to investigate the potential evolutionary origin of disgust with a web-based survey administered to more than 40,000 participants in all regions of the world. The study itself went like this. The aim of the study was to investigate patterns in disgust responses in all regions of the world. The study used an online survey administered to more than 40,000 participants in 165 countries. Participants were shown 20 images, including insects, sporting equipment, human faces, and mysterious substances. Some of the images carried a potential disease threat, while other similar images did not carry a potential disease threat. Participants were asked to rate their level of disgust for each image. The results indicated that disgust responses were strongest for images presenting a potential threat to the immune system. For example, a sweaty human face with an unidentifiable rash was rated more disgusting than the same face without sweat or a rash. And the bodily fluids of strangers were rated more disgusting than the body fluids of close relatives. Further, researchers found that disgust responses diminished with age, and that disgust responses were on average higher for women than men. The researchers concluded that the human disgust emotion may be an evolved response to objects in the environment that represent threats of infectious disease. It was theorized that disgust responses diminished with age because potential threats to the immune system are less relevant to reproduction as individual moves past the reproductive years. So further, disgust may have more evolutionary benefit early in life when individuals are more vulnerable to infection and disease and less fit to survive. It was also theorized that disgust responses were higher in women because of childbearing. So the heightened sensitivity to disgust evolved to protect offspring. So how interesting this is. That means disgust is more in women and in young aged people. The reason being that women are responsible for childbearing and young adults are responsible for childbearing as well. So these young people and women are responsible for childbearing or offspring for reproduction. So because of the reproduction, the levels of disgust emotion are higher in them. As they move on to the other gender, that is males, or they move on to a higher age, older age, the level of disgust lessens. The reason is that old people are not that much, obviously, are not into reproduction. So they have passed that reproducing age altogether, and males are not into childbearing altogether. So even their level of disgust is less. So level of disgust is less in males as well as in older aged people. The greatest strength of the study is probably its cross-cultural focus and large sample size. When it comes down to it, the validity of any survey is partly determined by how many people participate, and such high number of participants make the results more generalizable. Further, it's difficult to question the cross-cultural validity of a study conducted worldwide. However, limitations include the fact that disgust is clearly a subjective thing and is difficult to rate. For example, it doesn't matter if someone ranks a brownish green soup-like substance as only a little disgusting, because no matter what, they are not going to eat it. Also, surveys are known to be problematic because participants don't always respond thoughtfully or even accurately. So despite any potential limitations, the Curtis et al. Study did suggest an evolutionary explanation for the emotions of disgust. It involved to protect against potential threats to the immune system. Now, Curtis, Unger and Raby 2004 used a survey placed on the BBC Science website. The survey was advertised in a BBC documentary. It was completed by over 77,000 people from 165 countries. However, after data cleaning, the final sample size was slightly less than 40,000. For example, all participants who had watched the BBC documentary were excluded because they could have been exposed to the hypothesis of the study. First, respondents were asked to set of demographic questions on their age, sex, country, and so on. Then they were asked to rate 20 photographs appearing one by one on separate screens for disgust on a scale from 1, that is not disgusting, to 5, very disgusting. Of these photographs, 14 comprised 7 pairs of disease salient versus less salient stimuli. For example, one photograph depicted a white towel with a blue stain on it, and the paired photograph showed the same towel with a stain depicted in reddish yellow resembling blood and bodily secretions. So the results showed support for all 5 hypotheses. First, disease salient stimuli were rated as more disgusting than less salient ones. For example, the plate of organic looking fluid was rated as 61% more disgusting than the plate of blue fluid that looked chemical. Ratings were 1.6 versus 2.6. For the towel pictures, the organic looking substance produced much higher rating of disgust than the blue chemical. Second, the results were consistent across cultures. Third, females rated the disease salient pictures as more disgusting than men. This was true for all the disease salient pictures used in the study. Fourth, as predicted, there was an age-based decline in the sensitivity to disease salient stimuli. Fifth, finally, there was one question in the survey that asked participants to choose with whom they would be less likely to share a toothbrush. The average responses were ranged in the following order: postman, that is least likely; the boss, the weatherman; a sibling, a best friend; the spouse or partner. This shows that disgust is felt more strongly in contact with strangers than with relatives. So here we are done with two studies, and the third one we are going to do is the connection between evolution and disgust, specifically in pregnant women. So let's do the third study for your 22 marker questions. And if you are liking this video, please don't forget to subscribe. Keep watching this video till the end so that you get all the material that you need, all the concept that you understand to write in your 22 marker question, the general knowledge, the specific knowledge, and the supporting studies along to write with the conclusion. So please watch this video till end. Disgust and pregnancy. A similar evolutionary origin for disgust was explored in Fessler et al. 2005 study on disgust responses in pregnancy. While some women struggle with maternal illnesses like morning sickness during the first trimester of pregnancy, this is not universal. The study was designed to investigate whether disgust responses in pregnancy were associated with vulnerability to disease and infection. So many of the diseases that are more dangerous to humans are foodborne. But human ancestors couldn't afford to be picky about what they ate all the time. That's life in a hunting-gathering or pre-agrarian society. Natural selection may have helped compensate for the increased susceptibility to disease during the risky period in pregnancy by elevating disgust to make women more sensitive to potential threats to the immune system. This is especially evident during the first trimester of pregnancy when the fetus is most vulnerable. The sensitivity seems to diminish as the risk of disease and infection decreases in later pregnancy, and this is consistent with the view of disgust as a form of protection against disease. So this clearly means that, in earlier age when the humans were hunter-gatherers, or, when there was a stone age, so it was very difficult to check actually whether, whatever they're eating, the small animals, or by hunting whatever they're gathering, whether this animal they can actually eat or they can't eat, whether it is, free of bacteria or, it's safe to eat, because eating is something, food is one thing that, it can be fatal, it can lead to food poisoning, so it can actually make you very, very ill. So this was one of the reasons that what happened during this period of time. The disgust level in pregnant women, especially in the first trimester when the fetus is very vulnerable, very, very fragile, bit of food poisoning can actually have an effect on the fetus. So in order to protect the woman from this kind of rotten food so that she doesn't eat and get sick and it can impact the fetus, so in order to do that, gradually, very naturally, with the process of natural selection, this particular disgust feeling rised amongst the pregnant women. So this study tells us that the aim of the study was to investigate if disgust sensitivity varies during pregnancy. So the method was online survey of 496 pregnant women using a 31 item true false and Likert type scale based on questionnaire that required the women to rate their level of disgust in 8 areas, including contact with animals, body products, sex, body envelope violations, death, hygiene, magic based contagion, and food. So presence of morning sickness among the participants was controlled for via the first question in the survey, which asked women to rate their current level of nausea on a 16-point scale. So the findings showed that disgust responses were elevated during the first trimester of pregnancy, and although this disgust response was correlated with the morning sickness or nausea associated with the first trimester, the disgust responses remained higher even after controlling for nausea. The findings are consistent with the evolutionary foundations of the study. The disgust response appears to indicate evolutionary fitness, and since it's heightened during pregnancy, there's a clear connection to reproduction. Disgust appears to protect the fetus. It makes sense that over time, natural selection has favored the disgust response. So now we know that disgust emotion over a period of time has been passed on from generation to generation, and it has become stronger, even more for the pregnant women. They feel more disgusting during their trimester, during the first semester, because of the fetus is very fragile. We have already talked about it. So let's do the evaluation, that is the strengths and weaknesses of the study. So the evaluation goes like this. Trends are that large number of participants decreases individual variability and potentially increases the generalizability of the findings. Agrees with Curtis et al. 2004, and the two serve as to triangulate each other's findings on the association between disgust and protection from disease or illness. Third is effectively isolated the target population of pregnant women. This isolation is crucial as it illustrates the evolutionary adaptive role of disgust. Number 4, variables such as nausea through morning sickness were controlled for. This shows the disgust response as a function of pregnancy, not nausea. Fifth, clear connections to evolutionary theory as the study illustrated an increased level of disgust among pregnant women versus the general population, and specifically among women who were in the first trimester of pregnancy, a time at which the fetus is most vulnerable to infection. This establishes disgust as an adaptive behavior. Now, there are also limitations to this study. Limitations are such as: first is hard to rank disgust. Doing so is not consistent from participant to participant. Second, data were conducted through online surveys, which makes it difficult to verify who's responding and how seriously they take it. Third is written statements of disgust are a relatively crude way of measuring disgust sensitivity, so the study may lack ecological validity. The fourth is the disgust was hypothetical, thus the validity of the results may be off. Fifth, statistical differences were relatively small from a statistical viewpoint, but the researchers believe disgust responses would actually be stronger in real life than they were on a written survey. So now in your 22 marker questions, dear IB students, IB psychology students, you have to write 2 emotions and maybe 1 or 2 supporting studies. That completely up to you. So for one emotion, that is disgust, I have already given you 3 studies. You can choose any 2 out of it or 1 out of it. It is your call altogether. Now I'll be talking about attraction as the second emotion and how it is linked with the evolution. We'll be talking about it, and then following by that I'll be giving you the supporting studies as well. Have you ever come across statements like this, or people talking about or read things about men want women who are pretty, beautiful, good figure, attractive features, and so on. So they prefer females with all these kind of things. Why is it that we know that men like these particular things in women, but why do they like that? And men here would know that what all other things they like in females, but why do they like all these things? That is the question mark that evolutionary explanation of psychology is going to explain. Women, on the other hand, we have always seen they are, rather than seeing the more of physical features or more of how beautiful a man is, more than that it is the how much money they earn, what is their social status, how much is their power, their how rich they are. So these things count more when a woman is looking in a man. So why these things are there in our society, but why these things are there in the society? Can it be explained by the evolutionary explanation of psychology? So let's study. Well, evolutionary arguments posit that men and women may have different goals when choosing a mate. Males may be fertile for a good part of their lives. When looking for a partner, they would look for a woman who has high reproductive value. This is physically obvious: smooth skin, good muscle tone, full lips, and above all, young. Women, on the other hand, are limited in their reproductive ability, both due to age and the fact that they usually only produce 1 egg per month. According to Trivers 1972, women seek out a partner who will invest in their offspring. In animals, this investment includes providing food and defending the mate and the child against predators. In humans, they also aid in the rearing of their offspring and may provide status, power, or resources. So this has clearly been explained by the evolutionary explanation of psychology. Let's do some supporting studies and see if this is actually true. So there was this study by Buss, 1989, who wanted to test three evolution-based assumptions about human mate selection in a large cross-cultural sample. As men are searching for women with high reproductive value, they will favor youth and physical appearance. As women are searching for men who will invest in their offspring, they will favor a man with the resources he can provide. As men do not want to invest in another man's child, chastity will be highly valued. The study used samples from 33 countries with 10,047 participants with a mean age of 23.05. All countries had a sample of at least 100 participants except for Iran, which had 55. The samples from each country were collected using different techniques. For example, in Estonia, one sample consisted of couples applying for a marriage license at a specific location. Venezuela used a non-random systematic sampling technique by contacting every fifth house in a series of neighborhoods that varied in socioeconomic status. In Germany, an ad was put in the newspaper. In New Zealand, samples were drawn from 3 public high schools. Now, each sample was asked to complete 2 surveys. The first survey collected biographical data and asked participants at what age they preferred to marry, the preferred age difference between self and spouse, who should be older in a couple, and how many children did they want. They were then asked to rate 18 characteristics on how important they are using a 4-point scale, with 0 being irrelevant and 3 being indispensable. The second survey provided 13 characteristics that participants were asked to rank in terms of desirability in a mate. The surveys were given in the language of participants. They were back translated in order to make sure that there were no discrepancies between translated text and the original English language version. The results generated supported 2 of the 3 evolutionary assumptions. In 36 out of 37 samples, women valued good financial prospects in a potential mate more than males did. In all of the samples, men preferred mates who are younger, with an average of 24.83. This age preference is close to the age of peak female fertility. Females preferred mates who are older than they are. 34 of the 37 samples showed that males value physical attractive in potential mates other than females do. This was the trend in the remaining 3 samples, but it was not statistically significant. Only 23 out of 37 samples valued chastity. The one assumption that was not supported was that chastity is valued by men to guarantee the paternity of the offspring. However, as this is a behavior that cannot be easily observed, this may make sense from an evolutionary perspective. This may be more of a cultural construct than a biological one. So the evaluation of the study is such: the samples cannot be viewed as representative of the populations of each country. Rural, less educated, and lower levels of socioeconomic status were underrepresented. The sample was highly diverse with regard to geography, culture, and religion. The wide variety of sampling techniques used increases the generalizability, as the findings were consistent between groups, regardless of the sampling techniques employed. There were difficulties with construct validity. For example, questions about marriage were problematic in Sweden, where many couples live together but do not get married. In Nigeria, polygyny is common. Therefore, it is questionable how the questions reflected the possibility of having many wives. The researchers used surveys which provided them with quantitative data. They used a 4-point scale which prevents participants from gravitating towards the mean, which is common in Likert scales. However, there is still the possibility that the values of the 4 choices were not interpreted in the same way by all participants. The test provided parallel forms reliability, that is, the same responses were given on 2 different forms of a survey or test. So the researchers carried out the survey in the language of the participants. They used back translation methods in order to control that the meanings of the questions were the same in all languages. The results do not tell us why these preferences exist. It is not known whether the preferences are a result of genetic differences or socialization. There is a question of the temporal validity of the study. Zhang, Lingshan et al. 2019 carried out a replication with 3,073 participants from 36 countries and found that all the women preferred mates with good earning capacity more than men did, and men preferred physically attractive mates more than women did. They found little evidence that these sex differences were smaller in countries with greater gender equality. So I hope you understood this study and the evaluation of the same as well, because evaluation is very important when you are writing the evaluation in the 22 marker answers. Now we'll be moving on to the second study. Ronnie and Von Hippel 2010 carried out a study to determine if men would take greater risks in the presence of an attractive female than in the presence of a male. In addition, they wanted to see if testosterone played a role in this behavior. So this study you can write in the evolutionary explanation of behavior, in this one of course, and you can also write the same study in testosterone, under testosterone question as well. So when you know your the hormones question, any hormones question coming in that as well, you can write the study. So it can be used in both the topics. Okay, going further, they hypothesized that they would take greater risks as a result of intrasexual selection. That is, he who makes the greatest impression gets the girl. The sample was made up of 96 young adult Australian male skateboards with a mean age of 21.58. Participants were recruited at a skateboard parks. 43 were assigned to the male researcher condition and 53 assigned to the female researcher condition. Tests were conducted between 2 and 6 p.m. Skateboarders were asked to do one easy trick and one difficult trick, which they could successfully complete approximately 50% of the time. They were asked to do each trick 10 times. After a break, they were asked to make 10 more attempts of each trick, but this time in front of the same male researcher or an attractive 18-year-old female researcher who was blind to the hypothesis. The attractiveness of the researcher was established by having 20 male raters view photos of potential female experimenters. The skateboarders' attempts were coded for one of the three outcomes: success, crash landing, or aborted attempt. High levels of aborted attempts would be seen as an indicator of low risk taking. So saliva samples were also collected at the conclusion of the experiment to measure testosterone. Heart rate was measured by having participants with a Nordic sports watch. Measurements were taken immediately prior to the test and then measured throughout the task. As expected, participants took greater risk on the difficult tricks in the presence of the female researcher. That is, they aborted the trick fewer times. In addition, testosterone levels were higher in the men that skateboarded in front of the female researchers than in front of the male researcher. So there was no significant difference in the measure of heart rate between the two groups. The study showed that young men take greater physical risk when in the presence of an attractive woman, and that testosterone may account for this behavior. According to the evolutionary theory, this makes sense. The increased risk taking is a sign of potential mates that the male is healthy, strong, and dominant, that is, would be able to intimidate any potential rival. Now let's come and do the evaluation of the study, which I told you is also very important to do. So the evaluation goes like: the experiment is well controlled. The attractiveness of the female researcher, the time of the day, and the heart rate were all controlled for in this experiment. The experiment was also conducted under highly naturalistic conditions, leading to high ecological validity. The design was a repeated measure design. Order effects such as fatigue could have influenced the findings. It was also an independent sample design in that some had a female in the second set and some had a male researcher. The tricks that were tried in both groups could not be standardized for difficulty. This questions the validity of the measure of aborted tries as a sign of risk-taking. Although this could potentially be an example of intrasexual selection, it is difficult to establish that reproduction is actually the goal of the behavior. Finally, there are ethical considerations in the study. Although the participants agreed to be in the study, they were not aware that they were being observed for mating behavior. This could be seen as embarrassing when they are debriefed and told the real aim of the experiment. They would, of course, have the right to withdraw their data. So till now we have understood how evolutionary explanation of behavior is linked to different type of emotions, cognitions and thoughts and feelings. Now we'll be doing the criticism of the same. Does actually these feelings and these thoughts or processes, cognitive processes, has anything to do with evolutionary explanation or no? So let's do some criticism on the same. So now this evolutionary explanation of behavior is highly contradicting with neuroplasticity. Now we have already studied how neuroplasticity has any effect on the behavior of a human being. At the same time, we are also discussing about the evolutionary explanation of behavior. So how these are contradicting, and which one to go for. Dear IB psychology students, in your discuss question, 22 marker question, in discuss question, you can write this contradiction when you are writing in favor, and in the end when you're discussing and you have to write any counter argument. There you can give this counter argument study explanation along with the study. So I will tell you what is the counter argument here. So evolutionary psychology has a great explanatory power, massive modularity versus neuroplasticity. Now researchers have attempted to expand the field and propose that mind on the whole is a product of evolutionary processes. If you suggest that mind is a product of evolution, though you must also make one major assumption, modularity of mind, also known as massive modularity. It states that mind consists of modules that have evolved to perform certain fitness related functions. Now these modules must have a neurological basis, obviously. However, what we know about neuroplasticity contradicts this assumption. If the brain can change itself dramatically during the course of life, boundaries between modules are erased. This raises this question: how much neuroplasticity would be enough for us to challenge the assumption that the modules even existed in the first place? There have been advances that demonstrated that certain modules do exist. For example, macaques have been shown to have a specialized group of neurons that function as a snake detection brain module. These neurons respond very quickly to images of snakes even if the macaque has never seen a snake before. So highly specialized modules such as snake detection cause little doubt, but it is massive modularity on the whole that it is questionable. And to understand evolutionary explanation of psychology, we must know the environment in which the Homo sapiens have evolved over a period of time. But the knowledge of this environment is very scarce at the moment. We do not have a complete knowledge of the environment, so it is also difficult to say that it was actually the environment that led to this evolution of the brain of the human Homo sapiens. And second thing is testability. Testability is also very kind of questionable in this evolutionary explanation of behavior, where the researchers say that whatever we are linking or connecting evolutionary explanation with the behavior of a person, it could be just a story or just an assumption, or maybe by chance. It's just a coincidence. Maybe there is actually no connection at all here. So testing the same is very, very questionable. We do not have such, guaranteed answers, or we do not have a very significant answers here. The overall significance is very low. So testability is also to some extent possible, but to a large extent testability is not possible, due to which it is very difficult to connect these two things. Then is cultural variation. Now, just as neuroplasticity is not entirely compatible with the idea of massive modularity of mind, existing cultural variations and traits are not entirely compatible with the idea that these traits developed as a universal adaptation to the universal challenges that humans faced as a species. Of course, one can always claim that different geographical groups of people face different environmental challenges, but it weakens the evolutionary argument. This is why evolutionary psychologists prefer to study universal traits. So now I hope you're clear with the counter argument, which you can write in the counter argument knowledge in your 22 marker question. Let's do two studies you can write against evolutionary explanation of behavior. So what are these two studies? The first is Kesar and Sharma 1999, Cultural Traditions, Limitation of Evolutionary Explanation for Partner Preferences. So an analysis of 37 cultures showed that women valued potential mates' access to resources far more in those cultures where women's status and educational opportunities were sharply limited. This suggests that although findings such as those in bus study may show potential evidence of evolutionary forces at work in mate selection, we should not underestimate the role of social and economic factors in establishing mate preference patterns. Now, Kesar and Sharma 1999 found in their analysis of 37 cultures that females mostly valued a mate with resources in societies where women's access to education and workplace was severely limited. This makes evolutionary explanations limited, as they only explain human mate's choice in terms of evolutionary adaptiveness, ignoring other important factors such as culture and social norms. Another criticism of evolutionary psychologists claim that women universally prefer high status and well-resourced men comes from the methodological weaknesses of research to support this claim. Most of the studies into females' choices of mates were carried out on undergraduate students, as these women were expected to achieve a high education status leading to a secure income. Their preference for high-status men may stem from similar interest and prospects rather than be a search of a resourceful mate. Furthermore, research into evolutionary explanations may also suffer from a problem of validity in terms that it measures expressed partner preferences rather than the real life ones. It is also a retrospective approach, largely based on speculations about what may or may not have been evolutionary adaptive for our ancestors. There is no reliable way to check whether these suggestions are valid. Yet another criticism of evolutionary explanation is that it is a retrospective approach largely based on speculations. So the next study is Bullard 2005 Research Methods Limitations of Evolutionary Explanations for Partner Preferences. This study claims that evolutionary psychologists are mistaken in their claims of a universal female preference for high status men as mates. He argues that the majority of students attempting to determine female mate preferences have been carried out on female UG students. These women expect to achieve high educational status and so have expectations of high income levels. The fact that these women prefer high status men might be explained by a general preference for high status men, or it may be better explained in terms of a preference for men with similar interest, education prospects to their own. As a result, Buller concludes that the evidence for a universal female mating preference for high status men is weak or non-existent. So basically here what we are learning is that as per evolutionary explanation of behavior, the psychologist said that it is that women choose men on the basis of their power, their money, their social status, how rich they are, what kind of job they have, and so on, so that these men can support their offspring. So this is a part of or explanation of evolutionary explanation of by psychologists of the behavior. But the criticism says that this is not the case. The preferences all could be of those women who are, overall social status is low or their educational degree is low. These are the women who look for such men. Maybe the women who are already independent, who have already high income, high social status, maybe they do not prefer such kind of men at all. Or if they prefer, it is only because they want somebody at their own equality, and maybe they match, they are more compatible, they have equal social status, equal socioeconomic background, and so on, and not because of evolutionary explanation. So this clearly shows the criticism that they cannot be reductionist in nature, saying that all this behavior is only because of evolutionary explanation of behavior of mating. So that is all. We are done with the counter argument, with the concept, with the counter argument studies and the supporting studies as well, and I hope that you have understood it well. If you have any questions, or if you want to know that how to structure your answers for the explain, describe, discuss or compare command, we'll be doing the questions soon in other videos. So please do subscribe and keep watching the videos to learn more about IB psychology.